Thom Hartmann here on the news. You need to know this. 16 months after he shot and killed Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman was found not guilty on all charges. Late Saturday evening, a jury of 6 women gave their verdict in the case, which sparked national conversations about race relations in our nation. The shooting of the 17-year-old prompted rallies and protests about racial profiling and set off a wave of citizens, celebrities, lawmakers, and civil leaders who wore hoodies and repeated the now famous words, "I am Trayvon." After the verdict, some activists blamed a weak prosecution for failing to convince the jury of Zimmerman's guilt. Some pointed to a racially biased justice system, and others have cited Florida's pro-gun laws, like the Stand Your Ground law, for the trial outcome. When the news broke Saturday night, many people gathered in neighborhoods around our country to express frustration over the verdict. While the vast majority of demonstrations were peaceful, there were a few acts of vandalism in Oakland, California, a city that has witnessed many killers of young African-American men walk free. On Sunday, marches and rallies took place in major cities throughout our nation, including New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and no further violence was reported. Activists marched wearing hoodies and carrying signs that read "Justice for Trayvon Martin," and called on the Justice Department to file criminal civil rights charges against George Zimmerman. The DOJ released a statement saying they are looking into the shooting death of Trayvon and said, quote, "Experienced federal prosecutors will determine whether the evidence reveals a prosecutable violation," end quote. Despite the not guilty verdict, Trayvon Martin's family asked supporters not to resort to violence. The Martin family attorney, Ben Crump, spoke on behalf of the family and said, "For Trayvon to rest in peace, we all must be peaceful. All of America has to dig deep into their hearts to learn from this tragedy and make sure it's not repeated." In Screwed News, the Republican sequester is kicking people out onto the streets. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, 140,000 people won't receive housing assistance because of $2 billion in budget cuts. In Washington state, low-income residents are being forced to wait longer for Section 8 housing vouchers, and people who recently qualified for aid are having their assistance rescinded. In New York City, Republican austerity will force the Housing Authority to take away rental vouchers from 1,200 people who already depend on them. Federal officials have directed authorities to do what they can to avoid taking away housing assistance from those who rely on it. They say it's only a matter of time before Republican austerity measures will leave people out on the streets. In the best of the rest of the news, the SEC is actually putting a bankster on trial. The Securities and Exchange Commission says that while Fabrice Touré worked at Goldman Sachs, he defrauded investors in a mortgage security scandal that ended up costing them billions. According to the SEC, Mr. Touré tricked investors into buying a portfolio that was handpicked by hedge fund billionaire John Paulson. Allegedly, while Paulson was selecting the securities to include in the portfolio, he simultaneously was making huge personal bets against them. Although charges have not been filed against billionaire Paulson, Goldman Sachs agreed to a $550 million settlement for its role in the scandal. The SEC is suing Touré for fraud, negligence, and aiding and abetting Goldman Sachs in violating security laws. This case represents the highest-profile trial of anyone responsible for the events leading up to the 2008 financial meltdown, and it could mean that at least one small bankster will finally be found guilty for his crimes. 3 months ago, state lawmakers in Alaska approved a huge tax cut for the oil industry there, and now state residents are demanding it be overturned. On Saturday, opponents of the tax cut turned in a petition with 50,000 signatures calling for a statewide referendum vote on the new oil tax. To qualify for the ballot initiative, organizers only needed about 30,000 signatures, which represents 10% of the total turnout in the last statewide election. Republican Governor Sean Parnell and supporters of the oil industry tax break say it's needed to lure oil development to Alaska. But opponents say that the tax cuts are a huge giveaway, which will cost that state more than $4 billion over the next 5 years. Former State Senator Vic Fisher helped organize the petition and said this bill that they passed is against the interests of Alaska. Thanks to the hard work of Mr. Fisher and his fellow citizens, Alaska's residents will get their chance to vote on whether or not the oil industry deserves another tax break. And finally, Congressman Mark Takano of California spent more than 20 years as a literature teacher before getting elected. And it turns out he doesn't mind letting Republicans know that. Representative Takano recently graded a letter from GOP Representative Bill Cassidy, which was written to oppose the Senate's recent vote on immigration reform. Representative Takano then posted a picture of the marked-up letter online with a big red F at the top. Although it gave Congressman Cassidy praise for a strong thesis statement, Representative Takano then repeatedly cited a lack of evidence for points made throughout the letter. Like any good teacher, Representative Mark Takano suggested ways to improve the letter, like addressing the pathway issue, including evidence, and removing tawdry allegations. Congressman Takano even offered his time, writing, "If you don't understand the immigration bill, come by my office and I'll explain it to you." And that's the way it is today, Monday, July 15th, 2013. I'm Thom Hartmann on the news.